Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth, faced constant war, betrayal, and a plague that killed millions, and somehow remained, by nearly every historical account, calm. Cato the Younger stood alone against Julius Caesar, knowing he could not win, and did it anyway, without panic. Seneca advised an emperor who would eventually order his death, and wrote some of history's clearest guidance on living well right up until the end. These were not soft men living easy lives. They operated at the absolute top of the most ruthless, high-stakes environment in the ancient world, Roman politics and power, where one mistake could mean exile or execution. And they didn't survive and lead through luck. They operated on a specific internal system, a set of principles that the average Roman citizen didn't fully grasp, and that most people today still don't. Today, we're going to break down 7 of those principles, real practices drawn from real historical figures that quietly shaped how the most powerful people in Rome handled pressure, power, and adversity. And we're going to look at exactly how each one still applies to your life today, almost 2,000 years later. Secret 1. The Morning Premeditation. Marcus Aurelius began many of his days, according to his own private journal, by mentally rehearsing difficulty before it arrived. He would remind himself that he would likely encounter ungrateful people, difficult colleagues, frustrating obstacles, and he would do this deliberately before leaving his quarters so that when those things actually happened, they didn't catch him off guard. This practice has a name in Stoic philosophy: the premeditation of evils. It sounds bleak on the surface, but it's actually one of the most practical tools in the entire philosophy. The idea is simple. If you mentally prepare for friction, criticism, and setbacks before they occur, they lose their power to destabilize you when they actually show up. You've already processed the possibility. You're not reacting from shock. You're responding from preparation. Marcus used this constantly because he knew his day as emperor would be full of exactly these things. People would lie to him. Plans would fail. The Senate would resist him. Rather than hoping for an easy day and being blindsided when it wasn't, he assumed difficulty was coming and met it already composed. Here's how this connects directly to your life today. Most people walk into their workday, their relationships, their goals, hoping things will go smoothly. And then they experience genuine emotional disruption the moment something doesn't. A difficult email throws off their entire morning. An unexpected criticism derails their confidence for the whole day. This happens because they didn't do the mental work Marcus did. They assumed ease, and ease is rarely guaranteed. Try this tomorrow morning before you check your phone. Spend 2 minutes mentally walking through the friction you might realistically face. A hard conversation, a frustrating delay, an unexpected problem. Not to feel anxious about it, but to remove its element of surprise. When you've already considered that something might go wrong, it stops being a crisis and starts being simply expected. That's not pessimism. That's exactly what an emperor did before facing the most demanding job in the ancient world. Secret 2. The view from above. There's a specific mental exercise found throughout Marcus Aurelius's writing where he would deliberately zoom his perspective outward, imagining himself from a great height, looking down at Rome, at the empire, at the entire span of human history, watching armies move and emperors rise and fall like waves on a beach. He used this to put his immediate problems into proper scale. This wasn't escapism. It was a strategic tool for emotional regulation. When you're in the middle of a crisis, a political betrayal, a battlefield loss, a personal grief, your perspective naturally narrows. Everything feels enormous and permanent. The view from above was Marcus's way of deliberately widening that lens. reminding himself that even an empire-shaking problem was a small moment within an almost infinite span of time and history. Modern psychology has actually validated this exact technique under a different name: cognitive distancing, or sometimes called the balcony view. Therapists use it constantly. Step back. Picture the situation as if you're watching it from a distance, or as if it happened to someone else, or as if you're looking at it from 10 years in the future. The emotional intensity drops almost immediately, simply by changing the size of the frame you're viewing the problem through. Marcus Aurelius was using a fully formed version of this 2,000 years before psychology had a name for it. The next time something feels overwhelming, a deadline, a conflict, a fear about the future, try zooming out deliberately. Picture your current crisis as a tiny point in a much larger life, in a much larger history, in an almost incomprehensibly large universe. It will not eliminate the problem, but it will, almost immediately, shrink its emotional grip on you. Secret 3. Voluntary discomfort. As training, Seneca, despite being one of the wealthiest men in Rome with access to every luxury the empire could offer, deliberately practiced poverty. He wrote about setting aside days where he would eat the most basic food, wear rough clothing, and deny himself comfort. Specifically so that if real hardship ever arrived, it would not be unfamiliar to him. This wasn't moral posturing. Seneca was explicit about the strategic purpose. He wanted to remove the fear of poverty by occasionally experiencing a controlled version of it. Fear of loss, he understood, often causes more suffering than the loss itself, and the only real cure for that fear is direct, repeated exposure to the thing you're afraid of, on your own terms, before circumstances force it on you without warning. This is precisely why Roman statesmen and military leaders so often trained their bodies and minds through deliberate hardship. Long marches, simple rations, physical exertion, even when their position would have allowed them total comfort. They understood that comfort, left unchallenged, makes a person fragile. And fragility is a fatal weakness in a position of real power, where crisis is inevitable. This connects to your life in an extremely direct way, because the exact same principle drives cold exposure, fasting, and physical training today. When you take a cold shower, skip a meal, or push through a hard workout, you are doing precisely what Seneca did, voluntarily creating manageable hardship so that involuntary hardship, when it eventually comes, doesn't break you. This is not about suffering for its own sake. It's about building a tested, proven tolerance for difficulty before you actually need it. Secret 4. The dichotomy of control under pressure. Epictetus, who began life enslaved and later became one of the most influential Stoic teachers in Rome, built his entire philosophy around one core distinction. Some things are within your control, and everything else is not. Your judgments, your responses, your effort, entirely yours. Other people's opinions, the outcome of events, the actions of those around you, entirely outside your control. This sounds almost too simple to be called a secret of the powerful, but watch how it actually played out historically. Cato, the younger, opposed Julius Caesar's rise to power, knowing realistically that he likely could not stop it. He continued to act with full integrity and effort anyway, not because he was guaranteed to win, but because his own conduct was the only thing actually within his control. The outcome belonged to forces far larger than him. His job was simply to act rightly, regardless of what those forces ultimately decided. This distinction is what allowed Roman leaders to function under genuinely life-threatening political pressure without becoming paralyzed. If you tie your peace of mind to outcomes you cannot control, Whether the Senate votes your way, whether an enemy army retreats, whether the public turns in your favor, you will be in a state of constant anxiety, because none of those things are guaranteed. But if your peace of mind is tied only to whether you acted with integrity and effort, you remain stable regardless of what happens externally. Apply this today to anything genuinely stressful in your life. A job interview, a difficult relationship conversation, a business pitch. You cannot control whether the other person says yes. You cannot control the outcome. What you can control entirely is your preparation, your honesty, and your effort. Roman statesmen who internalized this lived with a kind of composure under pressure that looked almost superhuman to outside observers. And it wasn't superhuman at all. It was simply a clear, disciplined understanding of where their actual influence began and ended. Secret 5. Writing as a tool for self-governance. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations was never meant to be published. It was a private journal, notes he wrote to himself, often late at night or during military campaigns, as a way of correcting his own thinking, processing frustration, and reinforcing his principles. He was, quite literally, coaching himself through one of the hardest jobs in the ancient world, using nothing but a pen and his own honest reflection. This matters because it reveals something important about how Roman leaders actually managed the psychological weight of power. They didn't simply absorb pressure and push through silently. They processed it, deliberately, in writing, in a structured way that let them examine their own reactions and correct course. Marcus would catch himself feeling irritation towards someone and write through exactly why that irritation was either justified or, more often, a result of his own unrealistic expectations of other people's behavior. This is a direct, almost unchanged practice available to you today. Journaling, real, honest, reflective journaling, not just logging your schedule, gives you the same self-correcting function Marcus relied on as emperor. Writing down a frustration forces you to articulate it clearly, which often reveals that the frustration was based on an assumption rather than a fact. Writing down a fear forces you to examine whether it's based on something controllable or something outside your control entirely. The specific practice worth borrowing from Marcus directly: each evening, write down one thing that disturbed you that day, and then write through whether it was actually within your control and whether your reaction was proportional to the actual event. This single habit, repeated consistently, was apparently enough to help a Roman emperor maintain composure through war, plague, and betrayal. It is more than capable of helping you manage the comparatively smaller frictions of an ordinary day. Secret 6. Respecting death without fearing it. Roman Stoics thought about death constantly, and this was not unique to philosophers. It ran through Roman culture broadly, visible in everything from funeral customs to public monuments reminding citizens of mortality. But the Stoics used this awareness with a specific strategic purpose. Seneca wrote extensively about how a clear, unflinching relationship with the certainty of death actually clarified how to live, rather than creating despair. Marcus Aurelius kept this awareness close throughout his reign, in part because as emperor he was genuinely, constantly at risk, from assassination, disease, or the simple unpredictability of ancient life. Rather than avoid this reality, he used it as a forcing function for clarity. If today could be his last day, what actually mattered? Petty political squabbles fell away in importance. Genuine duty, genuine relationships, and acting with integrity rose to the top. This wasn't morbidity. It was strategic prioritization, using mortality as the sorting mechanism. Roman elites who internalized this didn't waste enormous energy on status games, grudges, or trivial disputes, the way many of their less philosophically minded peers did. because they had a constant, honest reminder of how limited and uncertain their time actually was. This connects to modern life almost without needing translation. People today avoid thinking about death entirely, and as a direct result, they often live as though they have unlimited time, procrastinating on meaningful relationships, postponing the things that actually matter, treating their days as infinitely renewable. The Roman elite who practiced Stoicism did the opposite. They let the certainty of death sharpen their sense of what was actually worth their limited attention and discarded the rest. You can do the same simply by occasionally, deliberately, asking yourself whether what you're currently stressed about would still matter if you knew your time was genuinely limited. Often, the honest answer is no. And that answer alone is enough to redirect your energy toward what actually does. Secret 7. Virtue as the only true currency. This is the principle that ties everything else together, and it's the one most often misunderstood by people first encountering Stoicism. The Roman Stoic elite did not believe wealth, status, or power were evil. Many of them, including Seneca, possessed enormous amounts of all three. What they believed was that none of these things constituted the actual good. They were simply circumstances, neither virtuous nor harmful in themselves, and entirely capable of being lost through no fault of your own. What they considered the only true, stable good was character, virtue, integrity, the quality of a person's choices and actions, regardless of their external circumstances. This is why Epictetus, who began as a slave with literally nothing, could be considered by his contemporaries to be free in the deepest sense, while wealthy, powerful men around him were often genuinely enslaved to their own fear of losing what they had. This single belief is what allowed Roman Stoic leaders to operate at the highest levels of power without being destroyed by it, because they did not consider status or wealth to be their actual identity. Losing position, facing exile, or even facing death did not threaten the core of who they were. Cato chose to end his own life rather than live under what he considered tyranny, an extreme historical example, but one rooted directly in this principle. His virtue, his integrity, mattered more to him than his continued physical existence under conditions he found intolerable. The modern application here is less extreme, but equally important. If your sense of self-worth is built entirely on your job title, your income, your social status, or other people's approval, you are building your identity on genuinely unstable ground. All of those things can change, often without warning, and often for reasons outside your control. The Roman Stoic elite built their identity instead on something that cannot be taken from them by circumstance: their own integrity, their own effort, their own character. That foundation held under the most extreme pressure the ancient world could produce. It is more than strong enough to hold steady under the pressures of an ordinary modern life. 7 secrets. None of them mystical, none of them requiring wealth or position to apply, which is precisely the point, since several of the men who lived by them began with nothing, and others held the most power the ancient world had to offer. Premeditate difficulty before it arrives. Widen your perspective when problems feel overwhelming. Train yourself through voluntary discomfort so real hardship doesn't break you. Focus entirely on what's actually within your control. Use honest reflection to correct your own thinking. Let the certainty of death clarify what actually matters, and build your identity on character, not circumstance. These principles ran the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen, and they did it through individual men managing their own minds with discipline and clarity. The empire is gone. The principles are not. They are sitting here, available to you, exactly as they were available to Marcus Aurelius nearly 2,000 years ago. The only difference between you and them is whether you actually use them. Until next time, stay sharp.